Timchenko brought Bogdanov to the Kremlin to meet Putin for tea, the senior banker tied to the security services said. There Bogdanov told Putin, "It is your company. I am for you in any case. Just tell me how to spend the money." The Siloviki had then trained their sights on Lukoil, at the time Russia's biggest oil major, forged out of 3 West Siberian oil units by the former Soviet Deputy Minister of Oil and Gas, Vagit Alekperov, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Alekperov was a wily Azerbaijani who'd been one of the founding fathers of the carve-up of the Russian oil industry. He'd always been close to Russian intelligence networks. Lukoil had initially sold oil through Urals Trading, the oil trader set up by former KGB officer and Timchenko partner Andrei Panikov, and it didn't take long before Putin's men had brought Lukoil to heel. The opening volley against Lukoil was fired in the summer of 2000, amid the first wave of Kremlin probes into the oligarchs. The tax police declared that they'd opened a criminal investigation into alleged tax fraud by Alekperov, which they said was part of an industry-wide probe that was later claimed to have unearthed a total of $9 billion in tax avoidance through special offshore zones created inside Russia. But it wasn't until September 2002 that the pressure on Lukoil really began to mount. Early one morning that month, Lukoil's first vice president, Sergei Kukura, was kidnapped by men dressed in police uniforms and wearing masks, who had apparently incapacitated him and his driver by injecting them with heroin, then thrown bags over their heads. Kukura reappeared only 13 days later, apparently at a loss about who was behind the attack. 4 months later, Russian police mysteriously shelved their investigation into the kidnapping. A week before, the government had announced that Lukoil had agreed to pay $103 million in back taxes, exactly the amount the government claimed it had lost through Lukoil's operations via the internal offshore zones. If Alekperov and Lukoil had reached some kind of compromise with Putin's new government, then, as with Surgut, there was no need for any formal takeover by the state. Later, a senior oil executive told me that Alekperov had agreed to hold some of his stake on Putin's behalf, part of a system of fronting for the Kremlin that was to become entrenched in Russia's most strategic industries. Lukoil denies any such system is in place. But while Lukoil appeared to quickly bend to the will of the new masters, a big chunk of oil output was still far out of the Kremlin's reach. Intent on rectifying that, the Siloviki were heading towards a standoff that would become the defining moment of Putin's rule, changing the face of the Russian oil industry and shifting the country definitively towards a form of crony state capitalism in which strategic cash flows were diverted into close allies' hands. The power of Putin's KGB men would be cemented, helping forge their return as a force on the global stage. It was a conflict that would also take down Russia's richest businessmen and subvert the entire Russian legal system. Of all the Moscow oligarchs, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the one most actively seeking to integrate his company into the West, most openly courting Western investors and leaders for support. He was leading the way in trying to instill Western corporate governance methods and transparency at his company after years of being a bad boy of Russia's Darwinian business scene. The conflict that unfolded as Putin's Siloviki fought to wrest away Khodorkovsky's control of Yukoz's West Siberian oil fields was at once a clash of visions for Russia's future and a battle for empire. It was to define Russia's imperial resurgence and Putin's efforts to restore his country as an independent force against the West. But it was also a clash that was deeply personal. It had its roots in a conflict at the end of the 90s when Khodorkovsky had taken away one of the last remaining black cash channels from Putin's closest allies, who'd formerly been at the heart of KGB operations to transfer Communist Party funds into the West. Khodorkovsky's takeover of VNK, or Eastern Oil Company, was one of the last big oil industry privatizations of the 90s, and seeing it seized from under their noses had been the final straw for Putin's men. It was the first conflict between Putin's group and Yukos, and the most serious one, said Vladimir Milov, a former deputy Russian energy minister. This is when it all began. Far away from it all now, as we sit in the oak-panelled conference room of his London office overlooking the leaves of Hanover Square, after a 10-year jail sentence and enforced exile from home, Mikhail Khodorkovsky claims he wasn't aware back then of the ties between VNK and Putin's KGB men. Had I known how much VNK was a structure in which the FSB had interests, I probably wouldn't have risked going in there, he said, dressed now in a simple quilted shirt, not unlike the padded jackets he'd been forced to wear in Siberian prison, as if it was a habit he couldn't break. It was the end of the 90s when Khodorkovsky had made it to the top of Russia's hurly-burly transition to the market, and VNK was one of the Russian oil industry's last prizes. When it was put up for privatization in 1997, the sale was heralded as a clean break from the controversial discount loans for shares deals. The company, forged out of the Tomsk neft oil fields surrounding the genteel central Siberian university town of Tomsk and the Achinsk oil refinery, was slated to go on sale for as much as $1 billion, nearly 10 times more than the loans for shares sales of Yukos and Sibneft had raised just 1 year before. Anatoly Chubais, the steely privatization czar, was determined to show the world that Russia was transforming itself into a real rules-based market economy. He wanted VNK to be sold for its true market value. The only problem was that the men who ran the company appeared to think that Chubais had promised it to them. VNK was meant to be the consolation prize for the KGB men behind it, after they'd watched much of the rest of the Russian oil industry swallowed up by the independent tycoons. It had served as a source of cash, an obstcheck, for them ever since it was formed in 1994. Much of its oil exports had been directed through companies connected to a little-known Austrian company called IMAG, which was run by Andrei Akimov, a senior foreign intelligence officer who'd headed the USSR's foreign banking arm in Austria, Donaubank, right up to the Soviet collapse. Akimov had been the youngest ever Soviet bank chief when he headed Donaubank at the age of 34, having been appointed just as the KGB began setting up schemes to siphon the Communist Party wealth through foreign bank accounts, while Vienna had long been a strategic gateway for Soviet funds into the West. Akimov's connections and Russia's foreign intelligence networks ran far and deep. Working as his deputy at IMAG was an economist who'd helped develop the early perestroika reforms under Primakov at the Institute for World Economy, the hive for foreign intelligence operatives. This was Alexander Medvedev, and he was to become Akimov's closest confidant, while IMAG was to become one of the earliest sources of financing for Timchenko's trading operations. Akimov had been so convinced of victory in the VNK sell-off that he'd had Medvedev appointed as VNK's vice president in charge of finance ahead of the sale. For IMAG, hundreds of millions of dollars in oil contracts were at stake. Almost ever since its creation, VNK had sold most of its oil through a trader called East Petroleum Limited, registered near IMAG's offices and run by another close Akimov associate, Yevgeny Rybin. When the state's 84% stake in VNK was put up for auction and Khodorkovsky decided to bid for it, he was heading into a hornet's nest. With the help of an American banker named Charlie Ryan, who'd been associated with Putin since he'd done a stint at the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development in St. Petersburg in the early 90s, Akimov was determined to win no matter what the cost. The two men were aware from the start that Khodorkovsky was bidding against them. "We decided we were going to buy VNK," said Ryan. "Sasha, Medvedev, Andrei and I were going to organize the bid with proper funds." But the sale turned into a bruising standoff between Khodorkovsky and Akimov's men, and the outcome was almost as murky as the loans for shares. The state's 84% stake in VNK was to be sold in two parts. One 50% minus one share stake through a cash auction, and the rest through an investment tender. But the first part of the sale was held behind closed doors, without being open to any scrutiny, while the second ended up being cancelled because there was only one bidder, a shell company representing Khodorkovsky's Yukos. Instead of setting up a new standard for transparency, the sale ended up looking just as rigged as the privatizations that had gone before. The government announced that Khodorkovsky's Yukos had won the cash auction with a bid of $775 million for a 45% stake. It had already bought a further 9% on the open market, making its stake a controlling one. Yukos had agreed to pay far more than anyone had offered in any of the privatizations that had gone before, but according to Ryan, Khodorkovsky had still skewed the outcome in his favor, leaving Akimov's team without a chance. Ryan said that Khodorkovsky's men threatened Akimov and his team, and then, between the first and second auctions, paid off a section of the Russian security services to raid the Federal Property Fund, which was organizing the sale. During the raid, they'd seized documents relating to Akimov's bid and then rigged the outcome, Ryan claimed. They saw our information and they knew we'd bid more. They then tried to borrow more money, guaranteed by their own oil exports, including from the exports of VNK, before they'd even acquired control over the company. Khodorkovsky and his team were able to raise more money than Akimov's and emerged with the winning bid. They never had any intention of taking part in the second auction. Khodorkovsky denied he was involved in any such actions, but what followed was a protracted battle over VNK's exports, which Akimov's team had pledged to sell through Yevgeny Rybin's East Petroleum for the next 20 years, as a further defense against the company's cash flow falling into outside hands. Khodorkovsky refused to continue this contract, and the standoff escalated beyond the boardroom, into the courtroom and then onto the street. 2 attempts were made on Rybin's life. The first came late on a snowy evening in November 1998, when a gunman fired at him on a Moscow street. The second came in March the following year, when a bomb exploded and killed Rybin's driver. Shaken to the core, Rybin fled Russia and went into hiding for the next 5 years. Akimov and his men were bruised and deeply humiliated by Khodorkovsky's takeover of VNK. The story of the battle for the company was little noticed during the chaos that followed the August 1998 financial crisis, but it was to define the future battle for Russia's oil sector. From then on, Akimov was set on revenge. And though he was in hiding in Vienna, Rybin began gathering compromising information on Khodorkovsky's Menotep group and feeding it to Russian law enforcement, most of all to friendly officers in the FSB. At first, Rybin's efforts didn't seem to be getting anywhere. But after Putin came to power, the atmosphere changed. Sechin and one of Akimov's partners began a campaign to convince the president that Khodorkovsky posed a danger to his hold on power, according to a senior banker with knowledge of the matter. Rybin had also enrolled Egor Ligachev, a prominent member of the old guard of the Politburo, who served as a lawmaker in the Tomsk region of Siberia, where VNK's oil fields were located. Ligachev delivered Putin a stark message. Khodorkovsky was endangering the existence of his regime, his men had all the country's financial flows under their control, and soon they would have more money than the state itself. Already, he'd bought more than half the state officials in power. It was a message that resonated strongly with Putin as he sought to shore up his power against rival groups. But despite the maneuverings, he was at first reluctant to follow the calls to take Yukos on. The company was too big and too well entrenched in Western markets. It seemed too complicated a task, said a senior banker close to the security services. It was the country's most recognizable, most widely traded company. It had become a symbol of Russia's market progress. The takedown might never have happened if it had not been for Khodorkovsky's own behavior. Instead of bowing to the Kremlin's will, as Lukoil and Surgutneftgaz had before, Khodorkovsky kept raising the stakes until it did become a battle over who would rule Russia and the direction the country would take. He was willing to bet his life on Putin's men not daring to arrest him. He believed they weren't strong enough and would not risk Russia's precarious transition to the market. In many ways, this was typical of him. He set about building his empire like a maniac, recalled his advisor Christian Michel. He was stoppable only by a bullet. Khodorkovsky himself admits now that he is an adrenaline chick, an adrenaline junkie, with a vastly reduced perception of risk. He'd first become aware of this many years before the battle for Yukos, when he was a chemistry student at the Mendeleev Institute in Moscow, specializing in explosive materials. I am a person who, for some reason unknown to me, does not have the feeling of fear, he told me with a wry grin in an underground bar in Zurich not long after his release from 10 years in jail. I have never had a feeling of danger from making a bomb or from holding one. My favorite pastime was always rock climbing without any safety equipment. This is not because I somehow overcame my fear, it's because I didn't have it. All those years in prison, I slept absolutely soundly. Even though there were situations when I'd been attacked with a knife, I would go back to the bunk where I'd been lying and would peacefully go asleep. It was funny, even for me to understand sometimes when people asked me whether I knew that behind my back there could be a knife. I just wasn't afraid. The first time Khodorkovsky heard that he could be in danger was towards the middle of 2002. Lukoil was already under fire, and the former KGB men he'd employed in his own security service warned him that the FSB had launched an operation, Operation Energy, to collect compromising information on the country's energy giants. In Yukos's case, they said the target was the company's operations with the shares of VNK. But Khodorkovsky assumed it was no more than a run-of-the-mill operation to seek information that could bring the oil barons to heel. This was not the first such operation, and we didn't think it was so radical, he said, when we met in the safety of his office in Hanover Square. Back in 2002, Khodorkovsky was unveiling his $7.6 billion fortune through his ownership of a 36% stake in Menatep. He'd become, relatively speaking, a beacon of transparency among the Byzantine rules that still governed most of Russia's business climate then. He was staking his company and his future on Russia's integration with the West. It was only 3 years since he'd represented the epitome of Russia's Wild East robber capitalism, accused of violating the rights of Western minority shareholders. But now he was seeking legitimization and protection for the future in Western markets, and in blazing a trail for better Western-style corporate governance standards at Yukos. He was still as intense and driven as when he started out in business in the Komsomol. But he'd swapped his heavy, thick-lensed glasses of the mid-90s for light designer glasses that seemed in their clarity to represent his new drive for transparency. Although he still dressed simply in jeans and dark polo neck sweaters, the abundant black hair he had sported in the 90s was now cropped short and had turned a steely grey, while his moustache was long gone. He'd hired a string of Western executives to oversee finance and production at Yukos, leading an industry-wide turnaround that finally helped restore output at West Siberian oil fields to its levels before the Soviet collapse. Across the board, the privately owned oil majors were hiring Western drilling equipment makers, improving their techniques, investing in equipment, and hiring Western accountants. Yukos was by then producing more oil than Kuwait. As Khodorkovsky won plaudits in the West for his transformation, while Yukos's stock price continued to soar, he deepened his engagement with the West further still. He wined and dined the Washington elite and launched a philanthropic organization, Open Russia, where Henry Kissinger and a former U.S. ambassador to Russia sat on the board. He sent a pioneering tanker of crude to Texas, the first shipment of Russian oil ever sent directly to American shores, and began lobbying for a pipeline to be built, independent of the Russian state, from Russia's far north Murmansk port to the US. All these activities only antagonized Putin's KGB men still further. Khodorkovsky's dalliance with the West was a direct challenge to their authority, while his lobbying of the other private oil barons to band together and build privately owned oil pipelines was an even greater threat. The oil pipeline system had always been the preserve of the Russian state, and granting access to it was seen as one of the few strategic levers the government still had to keep the oil barons in check. By early 2003, as Putin's security men began to step up their plans for revenge, Khodorkovsky was admitting privately that he might have a problem. One gloomy morning that February, we were sitting in the dim lamplight of his cavernous office in the fortress-like concrete hulk on one of Moscow's main thoroughfares that served as Menatep's headquarters. He spoke ever more quietly, as he said it was becoming clear that there was a group of people in the Kremlin who want to take my company. These men wanted to test once again whether state-owned companies could be more effective than private ones, he said, but he insisted, he was sure in fact, that Putin would never let that happen, that he'd meant it when he'd pledged not to overturn the privatizations of the 90s. Putin keeps his word, he said. I am absolutely not worried. The mood that dark grey February morning belied the tension and the background preparations for the battle ahead. Khodorkovsky clearly still hoped that Putin, despite his background in the KGB, had another side to his personality, one that had been nurtured by his work in St. Petersburg with the liberal and democratic Sobchak. And just a few weeks later, it was as if Khodorkovsky was preparing to battle for Putin's better angels when he decided to make a direct appeal to him. He'd already warned the month before that Russia stood at a crossroads, that the country could either go down the road of state bureaucracy like Saudi Arabia, where half the budget was spent on the wages of state bureaucrats, or it could take the path of Western economies, of increasing productivity and post-industrial societies with rising service sectors. When Russia's oligarchs gathered later that February for their by-now regular meetings with Putin around the vast oval table of the Kremlin's Yekaterinsky Hall, Khodorkovsky decided to frame the question of the gradually increasing state participation in the economy more starkly still. He had decided to make a point about state corruption, and began with a PowerPoint presentation boldly titled, "Corruption in Russia, a Brake on Economic Growth." He said that the level of corruption in the country had reached 10% of GDP, or $30 billion a year, at the same time as the annual tax take was estimated at about 30% of GDP. Why was it, he asked, that students were racing to qualify as officials in the Russian tax service, where the official wage was only $150 to $170 a month, while far fewer wanted to become oil engineers whose wages were 4 times higher? This could lead one to certain thoughts, he said, with a glance at the president sitting across the huge table. Then he raised the issue more pointedly still, turning his attention to a deal in which the state-owned oil giant Rosneft had made its first big acquisition of recent years, paying $600 million to acquire an oil company, Novaya Neft, which sat on huge reserves in Russia's far north. The privately owned oil companies had been eyeing it for months, but Rosneft had trumped them, paying twice the accepted valuation. The question was, Khodorkovsky suggested, where did the $300 million in overpayment go? An investigation should be mounted, he told the president, to pin down the reason for the overpayment. Whispers had been circulating for weeks that the difference was a kickback pocketed by officials. Khodorkovsky's gamble backfired badly. He'd hit one of Putin's rawest nerves. The discussion was being broadcast live on TV, and though Putin was smiling, he was clearly smarting. Rosneft is a state company that should increase its reserves, Putin said. Some other companies, for example Yukos, have an excess of reserves, and how it acquired them is to be one of the subjects we will discuss today, including questions of non-payment of taxes. I return the puck back to you. When I saw this on TV, I realized this was the end for us, said Khodorkovsky's chief of analysis, former KGB general Alexei Kondarov. We hadn't discussed it before. When he came out after the meeting, I said, Mikhail Borisovich, why couldn't you give the corruption presentation to someone else? He said, how could I give this to someone else? There are so few fighters among us. And so we began to have problems. I knew he, Putin, would never forgive him for this. Putin's men had taken $300 million for themselves. If Putin's KGB men had pocketed a $300 million kickback, it was the first major deal since he took the presidency in which they'd been able to enrich themselves. The deal had been structured through one of the initial owners of Novaya Neft, Andrei Vavilov, a former deputy finance minister who conceded he did not own all of it. On paper, Novaya Neft was owned by 6 obscure companies. According to one person familiar with the deal, Vavilov had kicked the money back to Putin through Rosneft's president, Sergei Bogdanchikov. When we spoke, Vavilov denied that any kickbacks were involved, and the Kremlin hotly denied any irregularity too. But judging by Putin's reaction, Khodorkovsky had hit a sensitive spot. For Putin, it was unthinkable for Khodorkovsky to openly challenge him over the deal. He deeply resented the allegation of his corruption when, to his mind, Khodorkovsky had acquired his fortune, in particular Yukos, in a corrupt way. Khodorkovsky had opened the door even wider for the Kremlin to attack his wealth. But he had laid down the gauntlet, in part because he had no choice. The Novaya Neft deal, which boosted Rosneft's reach, signaled that the rules of the game were significantly shifting in favor of the state, challenging Khodorkovsky's entire business model. He understood that to act in any other way was not possible, said Kondarov. He could not develop his business any other way, so he went for broke. He bet it all. He understood that in any case further ahead there could only be a dead end. From that moment on, it was as if Khodorkovsky was putting all his chips on the table, and he accelerated the expansion of his empire, driving through a $36 billion deal that would merge Yukos with Abramovich's Sibneft, creating the world's 4th biggest oil producer and the 2nd biggest in terms of reserves. The deal was announced without warning at the end of April, in a flurry of camera lights in the elegant lobby of Moscow's newest high-end hotel, the Hyatt, just around the corner from the Lubyanka headquarters of the FSB. It was as if Khodorkovsky believed the merger would provide him with an extra layer of protection, as he was joining his company with the Yeltsin family. But to this day, his business partner Leonid Neslin believes Abramovich was setting a trap, seeking to take over Yukos through the merger and squeeze Khodorkovsky out. Khodorkovsky continued regardless. He stepped up his drive for integration with the West, launching historic behind-the-scenes talks on the sale of a stake in the merged Yukos Sibneft to a US oil company, either ExxonMobil or Chevron. This would be yet another layer of protection for Yukos, keeping it beyond the reach of the Russian state. Only 3 months before, another group of oligarchs, led by Alpha Group's Mikhail Fridman, also a former Komsomol member, had agreed a groundbreaking $6.75 billion partnership with British Petroleum, under which the UK company would take a 50% stake in their Tyumen oil company known as TNK. It seemed only natural that Ukosibneft would follow. At first, Putin seemed to humour the negotiations, harbouring grandiose ambitions. One person familiar with the matter said that with the help of loans from Russian state banks, Ukosibneft would instead take control of one of the US energy giants. But while Friedman and his business partner Pyotr Arvin, who'd once worked closely with Putin on the St. Petersburg oil for food deals, kept a low profile and did everything they could to display loyalty to the Putin regime, Khodorkovsky began to step up his activities in the political field too. He'd been pouring funds through his Open Russia Foundation into philanthropy, seeking to teach young Russian teenagers the principles of democracy at annual youth camps and at a school he'd established outside Moscow for the children of Russian servicemen killed in action. Shortly before the merger between Yukos and Sibneft was announced, he'd made his personal political ambitions clear, telling the world he wanted to step down from the helm of Yukos when he reached his 45th birthday. That would be in 2007, just before the presidential elections scheduled for 2008. It seemed he was signalling his intention to run. Khodorkovsky had also long been in talks with parliamentary leaders about transforming Russia into a parliamentary republic, a move that would erase what many critics saw as the fatal flaw of the country's political system, the overconcentration of power in the hands of the president. The system, which allowed the president to essentially run the country by decree, had been tipped in favour of the president following Yeltsin's violent standoff with Parliament in 1993. A move to a parliamentary republic would strip key executive powers from the president and transfer authority to the prime minister elected by Parliament. Khodorkovsky insists now that these talks went on within Putin's full view and with his consent. He says they were not aimed at reducing Putin's power, but at forging a more balanced system after he stepped down in 2008 after 2 terms in office, which in those days was seen as the constitutional limit. But many viewed Khodorkovsky as driven by a growing megalomania and eyeing the role of prime minister for himself. Like many of Russia's business tycoons, Khodorkovsky was funding political parties in the Duma. This was actively encouraged by Alexander Voloshin, the Kremlin chief of staff, and his deputy, Vladislav Surkov, in the hope that it would help to turn the communists into more of a party of the left-wing bourgeoisie. But concerns were growing that Khodorkovsky was taking the practice too far. He was pouring tens of millions of dollars into funding the communists and 2 liberal parties, Yabloko and the Union of Right Forces. 2 of the top executives from his Yukos group headed the Communist Party candidates list, while one of his closest business associates, Vladimir Dubov, a founding partner of the Menatep Group, had already won election in December 1999 and headed the powerful Parliamentary Committee on Taxation. The clout Khodorkovsky wielded in Parliament was beginning to pose a challenge to the Kremlin's power. The situation was all too strongly underlined in May 2003, when the tycoon managed to secure enough parliamentary votes to block Kremlin efforts for sweeping oil sector tax reforms that for the first time aimed to restructure the Russian economy away from its over-reliance on oil income. Fast-rising global oil prices, from $12 per barrel in 1998 to $28 in 2003, had helped to rapidly boost government coffers and pay down foreign debt. But the increasing oil price was also further heightening Russia's dependence on oil and gas revenues to fill its budget and for economic growth. In 2003, oil and gas output accounted for 20% of Russia's GDP, 55% of its entire export earnings, and 40% of total tax revenues. The International Monetary Fund had produced a report which showed that Russia had become 5 times more dependent on world oil prices by 2003 than it was before the August 1998 default, when the precariousness of the country's reliance on the global oil price had become all too disastrously evident. If oil prices dropped back down to the $12 per barrel level seen last in 1998, Russia could lose $13 billion, the equivalent of 3% of its GDP in budget revenues, the IMF said. Russia's overarching dependence on global energy prices outside its control had long had the more liberal wing of Putin's government searching for ways out. In the Yeltsin years, the government was too busy lurching from crisis to crisis to reduce Russia's reliance on oil and gas revenue. It needed every source of income it could get as it scrambled to collect taxes. But now that oil prices were surging, the liberal faction in government, led by Alexei Kudrin, the finance minister who'd served under Sobchak with Putin in St. Petersburg, and German Gref, the economy minister, who'd also worked in St. Petersburg as the federal property chief, could finally seek to use the more stable situation and the burgeoning revenue to restructure the economy. As early as February 2003, Gref had announced measures to further increase the tax take from the oil industry's windfall gains in order to then plough state investment into high-tech and defence sectors. The government was seeking to raise taxation on the oil industry both through levying greater export taxes and a royalty tax. But Khodorkovsky was resisting the royalty taxes all the way. When in May his men in parliament were able to defeat one of the first government attempts to impose it, the liberals in Putin's government, Gref and Kudrin, took it personally. Till then, according to one senior banker close to Kudrin, they'd been seeking to defend Khodorkovsky from the growing appetite of the status security men to attack him. But he'd not only undermined their plans, he'd also undermined their arguments in his defence. He'd become a major investor in the Duma, the banker said. He was bankrolling half the Duma. It had become clear that to say he wasn't a threat was utter rubbish. The deal he put together to pull the vote on the increase in the tax burden was backed not just by a coalition of pro-business deputies, but by die-hard communists, rabid anti-Semite nationalists, liberals and conservatives. It was the most bizarre mix of people voting against a tax increase. Kudrin called him and said, "Misha, you're fucking up. You're not supposed to buy the organs of the state. There are people out there who want to increase taxes to 90%. You should have taken the deal." But you know what he told Kudrin? He said, "Who do you think you are? Go fuck yourself. I will have you removed." The situation, Gref and Kudrin believed, was becoming untenable. Khodorkovsky, the banker claimed, made things even worse when, jubilant after the vote, he began calling future candidates for the post of Prime Minister and telling them they would have to agree their agenda with him. He was telling them the vote was an objective demonstration of his control of the Duma. He said he now had the right to pick the next PM. Khodorkovsky denies ever making such calls. But a few weeks later, a report was published in the media claiming that he was the leader of a dangerous group of pro-Western oligarchs who were seeking to undermine presidential rule. Their aim, the report said, was to purchase majority power in Parliament and transform the country into a parliamentary republic where the president would play no more than an honorary role. The report, which described Khodorkovsky's recent actions almost exactly, was clearly intended to further justify the paranoia among Putin's men. It called the actions of the group of oligarchs anti-national. Their property was registered in offshore zones in order to protect it against the Russian state. It's possible to say the oligarchs appealed to the resources of other states as a guarantee of their political and economic interests in Russia. Having achieved the privatization of the main assets of the national economy, they are now moving on to privatize political power in Russia. The report exactly reflected the mindset of Putin's men. And according to its author and a senior banker close to the security services, it also reflected what they'd heard when they tapped the phones and offices of Khodorkovsky and his associates. Many of those who are in jail today are there because the security men heard exactly what they thought of them. They'd heard the insults in their name, said Stanislav Belkovsky, a well-known political analyst who co-authored the report. Soon Putin also began to make his feelings clear. Later that May, he called Khodorkovsky, Abramovich, and several of their key lieutenants to a private dinner in the oak-panelled reception room of his Novo Ogarevo residence. According to one of those present, over the meal they discussed the Exxon-Chevron deal. But when they moved on to the fine cognac, Putin ordered Khodorkovsky to stop funding the communists. He objected, saying he'd agreed the funding with Voloshin and Surkov, the chief and deputy chief of staff, but Putin told him, "Leave it. You have a big company, you have a lot of business to complete. You don't have time for this." Khodorkovsky continued to dig in his heels, saying he couldn't prevent the other Yukos shareholders from funding whomever they wanted, even if he himself stopped funding the Communist Party. He said, "If we are an open and transparent company, then I can't stop shareholders and employees from following a certain political line." He tried to explain to Putin that social projects and the support of democracy in Russia were just as important to him as the business. The conversation ended abruptly, and the guests left. But Putin wasn't going to leave the matter at that. As he prepared to leave Russia later that June, for the honour, pomp and ceremony of a state visit to the UK, his first as president, where he was to be feted by Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Queen, he gave the first hint of trouble ahead. In an annual press conference, he lashed out at the business barons for blocking reforms in Parliament to raise the tax take on the energy industry. Although he didn't mention Khodorkovsky by name, his reference was unmistakable. "We must not allow certain business interests to influence the political life of the country in their group interests," he said. For the first time, Putin had also spoken out publicly against reform of the political system to transform the country into a parliamentary republic. It was out of the question, he said, even dangerous. It was clear to everybody who Putin's statements were aimed at. And while he was out of the country, attending a glittering banquet in Buckingham Palace and signing off on the accord between BP and TNK, which Blair hailed as a sign of the UK's long-term confidence in Russia, the machinery of state rolled into action. Orchestrated to look as if it had nothing to do with Putin, Russian prosecutors were quietly taking the first fateful step in the attack on Yukos. They arrested the company's security chief, Alexei Pichugin, and then, on his boss Khodorkovsky's 40th birthday, charged him with the murder of a married couple who they claimed had tried to blackmail him over his orders to assassinate another Menatap employee. The threat from the Kremlin couldn't have been stronger. But Pichugin's arrest might have passed unnoticed had it not been for a much more high-profile arrest that followed a week later. Platon Lebedev, Khodorkovsky's wisecracking, long-standing right-hand man, the chairman of the Menatap Group, and the man behind much of its business, had been arrested. Suddenly, Khodorkovsky's world was on fire. Lebedev had been hauled from his hospital bed in handcuffs, charged with embezzling a 20% stake in Apatit, the fertilizer giant that was the first big enterprise privatized by Menatep. News of the arrest was splashed over newspapers everywhere, and $2 billion was wiped from Yukos's market capitalization in the space of a day. In the background, another criminal case related to the privatization of VNK was opened. Another senior Yukos executive was sought for questioning. The onslaught against Yukos had begun. That summer, the headlines continued relentlessly. Yukos's stock was pummeled as prosecutors stepped up their investigations. At the end of July, 4 days after Khodorkovsky had returned from a trip to the US to drum up investor support, prosecutors announced 4 more separate criminal inquiries into murder and attempted murder by Pichugin. The announcements dredged up all Khodorkovsky's worst nightmares. Under examination were not only the attacks on Yevgeny Rybin over the VNK shares, but also the killing in June 1998 of the mayor of Nefteyugansk, the West Siberian oil town where Yukos was headquartered. The mayor, with whom Khodorkovsky had been locked in conflict after Menatep took over Yukos, had been shot dead on his way to work on the morning of Khodorkovsky's birthday, and rumours had spread fast that he'd been killed by a zealous underling wanting to present Khodorkovsky with a birthday gift. Yukos had been preparing to spin off the service companies that employed nearly 30,000 workers from Nefteyugansk and its main production unit as it sought to streamline its cash flows. And the mayor had personally protested in a letter to Yeltsin about the city's plummeting tax take after the Yukos takeover. Thousands of the town's citizens took to the streets to openly accuse Khodorkovsky of ordering his death. But Khodorkovsky, according to a Financial Times journalist who spoke to him not long after, appeared genuinely disturbed by the killing. Khodorkovsky vehemently denied any involvement by him or any of his associates in the murders and attempted murders. In the case of the mayor of Nefteyugansk, his lawyers pointed to dangerous Chechen criminal groups which had had a grip on some of Yukos's exports until Khodorkovsky's men forced them out. And later, when the backgrounds of the KGB men Khodorkovsky had fought over VNK became clear, one person close to him suggested that the killings had in fact been organized by VNK's KGB backers, in an attempt to tarnish Khodorkovsky's name. Khodorkovsky sought refuge and protection from the United States. Immediately after the arrest of his key lieutenant Lebedev, he'd headed directly for the US Embassy, where among the bunting and the stars and stripes on display for Independence Day, he'd insisted to reporters that he didn't think the conflict between himself and the government could last. Soon after, he attended a conference in Sun Valley, Idaho, where he hobnobbed visibly with the likes of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. On his return to Moscow, he again sought to raise the stakes, declaring on national TV that any continuation of the attack on his organization would lead to an upsurge in capital flight from Russia that would ruin the investment climate and turn the clock back to the totalitarian past. But Khodorkovsky's overtures to the US had only antagonized the Kremlin further. In September, as Putin prepared for a major visit to the US, where he was to hold talks at Camp David with President George W. Bush, he had a stark message for anyone who thought he could hold the prosecutors back. These cases involve murders, he pointedly told US journalists. In such a case, how can I get involved in the prosecutor's work? He asked. If Khodorkovsky had ever had any chance of escaping the full force of the Kremlin campaign, the final straw for Putin came during his visit to America. He'd been invited to the New York Stock Exchange, where he'd addressed dozens of leading US executives and assured them of Russia's commitment to a market economy in which no privatizations would be overturned. On the sidelines, he'd met privately with the chief executive of ExxonMobil, Lee Raymond, the towering Midwesterner who'd led Exxon through its merger with Mobil to become the world's biggest company, worth $375 billion. Known for his aggressive style, Raymond had not minced his words with Putin, telling him he wanted to eventually buy control of Yukos-Sibneft after the first stage of a deal in which Exxon would buy a minority stake. Putin was totally taken aback. He'd never discussed any scenario in which a US energy giant could take control of Russian reserves with Khodorkovsky or with Abramovich. He'd been under the impression that the idea was for Exxon or Chevron to take a minority stake, while Yukos-Sibneft took a stake in one of the US energy giants too. For Putin, the exchange of shares was important, said one person familiar with the negotiations. It would have been an energy bridge between Russia and the US. But as the pressure on Yukos had grown that summer, shareholders had pushed to hurry a sale. They wanted to cash out completely rather than swap shares. For Putin, the sale of a controlling stake in Yukos-Sibneft to ExxonMobil was absolutely out of the question. He couldn't possibly approve the sale of control of Russia's strategic reserves to the US. It went against everything the KGB men stood for in their bid to restore Russia's imperial might. Friedman and Arvid might have been allowed to clinch a 50-50 partnership with BP, but they, unlike Khodorkovsky, had remained absolutely loyal to the Kremlin and did whatever they could to stay in the driving seat of the joint TNK-BP venture. Lee Raymond arrived in Moscow just a week later, apparently hoping to seal the deal. That day, the Financial Times splashed on its front page the news that Exxon was deep in talks to acquire a 40% stake in Yukos-Sibneft for $25 billion, and the stake could later rise above 50%. But instead of handshakes and toasts, Raymond was greeted by the news that more than 50 investigators bearing machine guns and wearing bulletproof vests were raiding Yukos-related locations across Moscow, including the homes of some of Khodorkovsky's closest partners, the other main shareholders in Menotep, who lived together in a guarded compound behind a high metal fence outside Moscow in the elite village of Sukhovka, among them Lebedev, who was already in jail. When Khodorkovsky received a call from his wife that the police were swarming outside the door, he hurriedly made his excuses to Raymond and left. The signalling from the Kremlin could not have been clearer. ExxonMobil was never going to get its deal. When Khodorkovsky received the call from his wife, he and Raymond had been attending a conference hosted by the World Economic Forum, at which Putin was due to make a keynote speech. But while Khodorkovsky rushed home to secure his house against the raids, all Raymond could do was warn the conference that Russia should not arbitrarily restrict any investor if it wanted to participate in world markets. Putin, as if blissfully unaware of the raids, continued to insist to investors that he was doing everything he could to remove hurdles to investment. It was typical of the double speak he'd employed ever since he'd begun his rise to power. He spoke in praise of the market, while behind the scenes his security men were doing everything they could to seize control for themselves. Still, Khodorkovsky refused to back down, announcing to the world that he was ready to go to jail, if that was what it took to defend his company. He would not leave the country and give up the fight. Privately, however, he had been desperately seeking a way out, even visiting Pugachev, his old rival from the 90s, who was by then close to the St. Petersburg security men, to ask him about the Kremlin's motivations. Pugachev, after making inquiries, had an unambiguous message for him. If he wanted to remain free, he should leave the country. Otherwise, he told him, he was going to jail. Khodorkovsky said he did not believe it. The Kremlin would not dare to arrest him, and if it did, the United States would step in to defend him. It was a sign of his hubris, his overestimation of the lengths the US would go to protect an oligarch who'd sought to build bridges with it. Khodorkovsky was defiantly touring Siberia on a business trip when it happened. The prosecutors had called him in for questioning the previous day, but he was far from Moscow. Shortly before dawn in the morning of Saturday, October the 25th, 2003, his private jet had landed at an airstrip in Novosibirsk to refuel when a squad of armed FSB commandos forcefully came on board. Khodorkovsky had been in a first-class compartment when they broke in on him, shouting, "FSB, put your weapons on the ground, don't move or we'll shoot." He was arrested on charge of large-scale fraud and tax evasion, and by the evening he was in Moscow's notorious Matrosskaya Tishina jail. This was the moment when Russia's political and economic course turned irrevocably away from a Western-led global integration and took a course of its own that was heading for collision with the West. It was the point of no return for the group of statist security men who had lobbied and plotted and eventually convinced Putin that there was no other way to ensure the Russian state's resurgence and their own financial clout. But it was uncharted territory as much for them as it was for the country. While few had expected things to go so far, many in the business community hoped there was a way back, that Khodorkovsky could be freed and the two sides could settle. Even Pugachev said the expectation had long been, even among some of the Siloviki, that Khodorkovsky and his associates would agree to pay Putin and his men a significant sum of cash to make the charges go away. Everyone was waiting for the kickback, he said. No one was really prepared. No one knew what to do with the company. They had no experience of running things then. Khodorkovsky's arrest sent the entire business community into a state of shock. He was the country's richest man, the most prominent proponent of the market, the man who'd been on the brink of pulling off the deal of the century, the sale of his company for $25 billion just 7 years after he'd acquired it for $300 million. If he could be taken down, it could happen to any of them. The day Khodorkovsky was arrested, leading members of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, which had become the main official representative organ of the oligarchs, gathered for an emergency meeting in Moscow's Balchug Hotel. Many were too fearful to speak directly to the press, but collectively they wrote a muted and hesitant letter to Putin condemning the arrest and calling for an audience with him. Only the clear and unambiguous position of the Russian President Vladimir Putin can improve the situation. Its absence will make the worsening of the investment climate irreversible and will turn Russia into a country unfavorable to those developing their businesses. Anatoly Chubais, the privatization czar and author of Russia's liberal reforms, took the message a step further. In a TV interview that weekend, he warned that Khodorkovsky's arrest and the lack of clarity over whether other business leaders might be next could lead to an uncontrollable split in the elite that could draw in the whole of society. But Putin was not going to step back now. Though he consistently denied having anything to do with Khodorkovsky's arrest, such things did not happen without a clear nod from the top. Above all, Khodorkovsky's arrest showed that he'd failed to grasp a basic tenet of Putin's rule that later other oligarchs, through his experience, came to understand all too well. When you buy in Russia a large oil company for $150 million with the help of deposits from the finance ministry, then you have to play according to Russian rules, said Dmitry Gololobov, a lawyer who once worked for Khodorkovsky but ended up turning on him. You can't say you are the legitimate owner. Privatization didn't create legitimate property. The other oligarchs understood this well. None of them claimed they were actually owners of the business. They understood they were just holders. This way of thinking went against everything Putin had claimed to stand for when he ran for the presidency. It was a deception rooted in the KGB's belief that they had made the tycoons when Russia began its transition to the market, that everything the new billionaires had won was owed to them. What happened to Khodorkovsky was revenge for the 90s, when the KGB had been forced to wait on the sidelines, pushed aside by the growing reach of the Western-leaning Moscow tycoons. What's happening now with Putin is the revanche of the KGB, said one former senior-level military intelligence officer at that time. The KGB created the oligarchy, and then they had to serve it. Now they are having their revenge. The battle had reached a point where the KGB felt they could justify their asset grab by telling themselves they were preventing the handover of the country's richest oil assets to the West. Yukos had the intention to hand over the largest part of its assets to the West, said one of their number. The capitalization that Khodorkovsky built like lightning, all the assets would have floated abroad through fake offshore companies. If we had not stopped this, then we would not have kept control of our oil and gas industry. We would have become the servants of Western industrialists for a long time. And so, over the days that followed Khodorkovsky's arrest, the rest of the nation's billionaires watched in horror as prosecutors seized his $15 billion stake in Yukos-Sibneft. Putin firmly told them there would be no dialogue over the arrest, and the stock market went into freefall. On the Monday, immediately after the arrest, Putin issued a brusque and unequivocal response to the oligarch's call for clarity. There will not be any meetings or bargaining over the activities of law enforcement agencies as long as these agencies stay within Russian law. Everyone should be equal before the law, irrespective of how many billions of dollars a person has on his personal or corporate account. Otherwise, we will never teach and force anyone to pay taxes and defeat organized crime and corruption. It was a new era. Putin had cast off much of the hesitancy that had marked the first 2 years of his presidency. The Kremlin's new masters were ready to carve up the country's strategic assets for themselves. There was no way back, either for Putin or his men. Chapter 8. Out of Terror, an Imperial Awakening. It's like a knot with 3 elements. Vladimir Putin had seemed to begin his presidency as a reluctant leader. When he was catapulted to power, he told Boris Yeltsin he hadn't been ready to take the job on, and described himself to members of the Yeltsin family as the hired manager, suggesting he would serve only a few years. When disaster struck, such as the sinking of the Kursk submarine, he had a habit of withdrawing, paralyzed into inaction, sometimes as white as a sheet. But now that he'd ordered the arrest of Russia's richest man, there was no going back. Even if he'd wanted to, he didn't feel he could. His inner circle in particular, the Siloviki he'd brought with him from St. Petersburg, pressed him to stay on. They would frighten him, said Pugachev. They told him, no one will forgive you for Yukos, for the takeover of NTV. If you go to the West, they will arrest you at once. Now that they'd tasted power, the KGB men were not about to step aside. They were preparing for a further takeover of the country. Following Putin's re-election in 2004, they would be freed from some of the agreements he had made with the Yeltsin family when he took over from them. Putin had eliminated the media tycoons Vladimir Gazinsky and Boris Berezovsky. Early reforms launched by his administration had drastically reduced the power of regional governors through the creation of super-regions, ruled over by Kremlin-appointed plenipotentiary leaders. Such measures, led by Dmitry Kozak, a former military intelligence officer and prosecutor from St. Petersburg, had reversed the policies of the Yeltsin years, when the president had commanded his governors to grab as much freedom as you can. Liberals and the former media tycoons warned darkly of the revanche of the KGB, of the Kremlin's increasingly authoritarian grip. The arrest of Khodorkovsky and the seizure of his stake in Yugos-Sibneft had sent tremors through the stock market and the business community. But Putin and the Kremlin sought to portray it as an isolated case, punishment for one rogue oligarch who had gone too far. The rest of the country was reveling in the benefits of a surge in oil prices, which had climbed from $12 to $28 per barrel since Putin came to power. Reflecting public approval of the end of the chaos of the 90s and of his efforts to put the oligarchs in their place, Putin's ratings throughout his first term were consistently at around 70%. All the signs were good for him to sail into a second term. But the takeover of NTV and the arrest of Khodorkovsky were not the only events that had scarred his first term with controversy. And according to one inside account, never before revealed, some leading members of the Siloviki were seeking to leave nothing to chance. On the evening of Wednesday, October the 23rd, 2002, at least 40 armed Chechen fighters fired into the Dubrovka Musical Theatre in a Moscow suburb south of the Kremlin, firing assault rifles into the air just as tap dancers trooped across the stage for the opening of the second act of a popular new Russian musical, Nord-Ost. The theatre was packed with a nearly 900-strong audience, members of a middle class that was beginning to thrive in Putin's Russia, there to see a show that paid homage to the bravery of the Soviets during the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War. The Chechens proceeded to wire the building with explosives, while some of the hostage-takers, women known as Black Widows, dressed in black hijabs, who appeared to have belts of explosives strapped to their bodies, stationed themselves among the terrified audience as the fighters sealed off the auditorium. The siege that played out over the next 3 days appeared to be Putin's worst nightmare. The Chechen fighters, led by Movsar Barayev, the nephew of one of Chechnya's most renowned rebels, were demanding an end to Russia's war in the Republic, which had been going on ever since the 1999 apartment bombings that spurred Putin's rise to power. They gave Russia 7 days to withdraw its troops, or they would blow the building up. The evening the news of the siege broke, opposition politicians and security officials alike gathered outside the theatre in the dark and the cold rain, shocked that this could have happened a mere 3.5 miles from the Kremlin. How had so many rebels armed to the teeth with explosives been able to enter the theatre, apparently in plain sight? For the next 3 days, Putin did not stir from his office on a top floor of the Kremlin, seized by panic at the events spiralling out of control in the world below. As he cast about for a way out of the crisis, he cancelled a planned trip to Mexico, where he'd been due to meet world leaders, including US President George W. Bush. The hostage-takers had allowed some prominent individuals into the theatre to negotiate, including Member of Parliament and well-known singer Yosef Kobzon, liberal opposition politicians, and a journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, renowned for her fearless reporting on the war in Chechnya. Although they secured the release of a number of hostages, including some of the children and foreign citizens, the attackers refused to back down on their demand for an end to the war. On the third evening of the siege, a crew from NTV was allowed in to record an interview with Barayev. "Our goal, which we have declared more than once, is to stop the war and get the troops out," he said. A female hostage-taker, apparently wearing an explosive belt, told the reporter, "We are following Allah's path. If we die here, that won't be the end of it." Again, Putin was paralyzed by fear. The attackers had made it clear that they would kill the hostages and blow up the building if the security forces sought to intervene. And already there'd been deaths. 2 civilians and 1 FSB colonel seeking to enter the theatre had been shot dead. The Russian security services finally acted just before dawn broke on Saturday, October the 26th. In order to avoid the hostage-takers setting off the explosives, a gas was released into the auditorium through the theatre's ventilation system. But although it knocked out the hostages and some of the Chechen fighters, it also left many of the hostages dead, while the emergency services were ill-equipped and unprepared to deal with those still alive who were laid on the roadside, some vomiting, some unconscious, others choking on their tongues. 90 minutes passed before they were taken to hospital for treatment. Expecting to find a bloodbath from explosions and gunfire, 80% of the ambulances that arrived on the scene were equipped only to deal with trauma wounds, not the effects of gas. By the end of the following day, the death toll among the hostages was at least 115. Only 2 had been killed by gunfire, the rest had died from the gas. For a time, Putin faced an outcry over the handling of the siege. How had it happened in the first place? Why weren't the emergency services adequately informed of the nature of the gas? According to several witnesses who survived the attack, the gas had seeped into the auditorium from under the stage, knocking out the captors nearest to it, but filtering into the hall slowly enough for some of them to notice a caustic smell and a green-looking gas. Facing mounting pressure to identify the gas, Russia's health minister eventually claimed it was an aerosol derivative of the anesthetic fentanyl, a potent opioid widely used as a painkiller, which he said cannot in itself be called lethal. The reason the hostages died, he claimed, was that they'd been weakened by 3 days of severe stress, dehydration, and hunger. In the final report by Moscow prosecutors, which eventually emerged a year later, the gas was labelled only as an unidentified chemical substance. What took place in the Kremlin on the night the theatre was stormed has been locked ever since behind a wall of secrecy. But now, one insider who said he was involved in the Kremlin discussions back then has begun to open a window. He claimed that what happened was the deadly unravelling of a plot that had not gone according to plan. In his account, the attack on the theatre was planned by Nikolai Patrushev, the gnarled FSB chief, to further cement Putin as president. It was intended as no more than a fake exercise that would boost Putin's authority when he successfully brought it to an end, and increase support for the war in Chechnya, which was beginning to flag. Patrushev, this person says, told Putin that the terrorists for hire were not armed with real bombs, and that when the siege was over, they would be flown to Turkey under FSB protection, while Putin would emerge as a hero, as the one world leader who'd ended a hostage crisis without any civilian deaths, and then he could tighten control in Chechnya. But everything unraveled on the very first day of the siege when one of the Chechens shot dead a civilian trying to enter the theatre. Putin plunged into panic, the insider said. Everything spiraled out of control. No one knew who or what to trust. By the time the security forces